Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight, and also to everybody who's joining remotely through Facebook or through various online forums. This is exciting. I feel like I'm amongst friends. You have to be friends, and we have to be kindred spirits if you come out on a weeknight to listen to philosophy and theology and history. So namaste, I salute the forms in you that are also in me. As John said, my background educationally was in bioengineering. Then I did my first postdoctoral fellowship at Cornell University in the Department of Human Development. And so I was really looking through these lenses of biomedical engineering at how can we promote human flourishing. Right now, my training is going into the clinical domain and looking at ways that we can take these various principles of human flourishing and translate them into some kind of application that's related to disease, healing from disease, and restoring health in a medical context. A few instructions for you. This will be harder for the folks who aren't in the room sharing space-time coordinates with us, but for those of us who are here congregated, if there's conceptual clarification along the way, just like feel free to stomp your feet. Let's just practice it now. Everybody stomp your feet. Yes, okay, good. If you feel agreement with something, if it resonates with you as valid and sound, snap your fingers. Let's go and practice that. All right, there we go. Excellent. And if I hear this at the same time, I'll be so flustered of which direction to take this. Feel free to ask questions. John said that we will have a more extended dialectic at the end, but as we go along, please feel free to share the connections that you're forming. This is radically interdisciplinary work. And I get excited by hearing the ways that your concepts are fusing together. So feel empowered to make those known to the group. This is an open-ended question. I don't have any content on this slide because I'm curious to take the philosophical temperature of the room and find out what you would say if someone were to ask you, who is Aristotle and why do we care what he thought?
One of the first scientists.
Oh, yeah, we need the microphone, sorry. Otherwise people can't hear you online.
Oh, sorry. From what I know, he was one of the first science people or scientists. You know, he was into astronomy and studying the planets and the stars and some mathematics too. So,
yeah, definitely a very early pioneer of what we now call the physical sciences, for sure.
okay.
Other thoughts? Who is Aristotle? Why are we talking about him over 2,000 years after his death?
I think his writings and his conclusions are very profound, and a lot of philosophers over the centuries have referred to him and debated posthumously with his ideas.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Any other thoughts? From the back row.
I guess we get the phrase Aristotelian logic from somewhere. He must have, I guess logic was a strong aspect of his thought process.
Right, very much so.
We could say he was the person who broke clearly away from the idealism of Plato into the materialism that followed.
Gold star. Yes, Aristotle very much was the student of Plato who broke from what was known as idealism, or in other words, a very strong focus and preoccupation with the realm of ideas and of forms. So Aristotle's corpus of works is so vast. If I really want to feel terrible about how much I've accomplished in my life, I just look at the list of works that Aristotle put together and, try not to feel too badly about myself, though. So he, for all intents and purposes, invented what we now call logic, wrote many works just on logical processes and logical reasoning, wrote extensively on natural philosophy, which again has speciated into what we now call the natural sciences. So his books on the physical world are so far-reaching, exploring the nuances of the body, exploring the diversities of biology, exploring what dreams are about and why those are part of the physical world. Metaphysics, the reasons why things exist as they exist, as well as ethics, writings on politics, and then rhetoric and poetics. Just this unbelievable mind. And for someone who is that brilliant and that prolific, it captures my attention. I want to tune into that. I want to get some of whatever sauce he was putting on his food. When we talk about the soul, Aristotle basically invented the concept of the soul that has been passed down through the entirety of Western and Middle Eastern civilization. Aristotle has a treatise that in Latin is titled De Anima, and it's translated into English under the title On the Soul. And he asserts that the soul, which is the vital principle of life, is one of the most difficult topics on which to say, sorry for the extra ing, on which to say anything definitive. So naturally, since it's one of the most difficult topics on which to say anything definitive, that's where I want to race right to it and figure out what's going on there. What is the soul? We're going to start with a deceptively simple definition. Soul is that which animates the body. Aristotle talks about 4 categories of causes. He describes the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Now, if we're saying that soul is that which causes animation to the body, then looking through this Aristotelian lens, we can think of this in at least 4 different categorical ways. First, the material causes of animation, or in other words, what is the animator's substance? The formal causes of animation, which could be asked by what is the animator's form? The efficient causes of animation, what is the animating force? And the final cause of animation, what is the purpose of animation? Or in other words, what is the purpose of ensoulment? As I said, Aristotle developed the concept that has been passed down through Near Eastern, Western civilizations. In Christianity, the writers Pseudo-Dionysius as well as Aquinas picked up on Aristotle's concept of soul and integrated it centrally into their writings on mystical theology and theological explications generally. In Islam and Arabic philosophy, you have great minds like Al-Farabi, Averroes, and Avicenna, who also took Aristotle's concept of the soul and then elaborated in a different direction on the implications and the nature of soul. And even within the secular world, philosophy of psyche, psyche being the Greek for the word that's translated into soul, has evolved into the field that we call psychology. So the logic of the study of the psyche. As was mentioned in our philosophical temperature taking on the room, Aristotle was a student of Plato, and Plato was very, very committed to what has come to be known as idealism, which again is a focus on the world of ideas and how this world of forms that is transcendent from the material physical world has dynamics and self-existence. But Aristotle was very committed to materialism, to understanding what is happening here and now in this space-time matrix that we inhabit. So you've got this painting of the School of Athens, and a detail of the interaction between Aristotle and Plato is very demonstrative of this relationship between Plato's expression of idealism versus Aristotle's continuing focus on materialism and the complex dynamics of the physical world. You see Plato is pointing upward, you've got to look at the world of ideas. And Aristotle is saying, no, dude, let's keep this under wraps and talk about empiricism. So whatever happened to the soul? There's so many conferences focused on the philosophy of mind and the study of mind, but it is very rare to hear somebody talking about philosophy of soul, or much less to find an academic conference on philosophy of soul, even less so to find an academic conference on the science of soul. In most cases, yeah, that would elicit just this laugh response, people assuming that those are inherently contradictory pairings, to say science and soul together. I would assert that one of the ways that we lost the soul was through René Descartes' assertion that mind is the central problem that we should occupy ourselves with when it comes to philosophy and when it comes to science. In his epistemology, in his assertion of how he knows what he knows, one of the famous phrases that's been sloganeered is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I have cognitive processes, therefore I have existence. As a result of René Descartes' legacy, again, it was coined as a mind-body problem. You don't hear people talking about the soul-body problem, even though, again, I think that's a lot richer of a question and of a set of topics. So to reiterate, philosophy, sciences, they're extremely committed to understanding the mind. They've almost got this aversion to talking about soul, much less understanding soul. Fast forwarding into more current philosophy, you have a movement that has been known as illuminative materialism, which is to say that this notion of mind itself is also a folk notion, that we're really silly if we think that mind is something that has its own set of rules that need a different type of description other than what we get from looking at the brain as a physical organ. Paul Churchland is very notable in this movement toward illuminative materialism in saying that stop talking about mind and focus instead on brain. And the thought process there, in essence, is that once we just have this exquisitely detailed understanding of brain, then all of these questions about mind will, fall into place, and that the whole knotted ball of yarn will become unraveled on its own. I totally disagree, but that is the gist of illuminative materialism. There are several ways that you can present counterpoints to the notion of illuminative materialism, and these are by no means exhaustive, nor are they the most important per se. These are ones, though, that I find very useful and very interesting. One counterpoint comes by way of Daniel Dennett, who is an American philosopher of mind, and Dennett is very committed to this idea that mind evolves. And by that, I don't mean, an individual's mind developing over the course of an individual organism's lifespan, but rather that over the swath of the history of civilization, that consciousness is evolving. And Daniel Dennett has elaborated extensively on what is referred to as memetics, meme theory. So way back when Richard Dawkins wrote The Selfish Gene and said that genes are interested really in their own survival. They're not interested so much in the organism's survival that they're hosting, as long as the genes get replicated and passed on. Then Dawkins said, and there's probably at the realm of ideas something that we could conceptualize as a similar type of competition, replication, and evolutionary process. And he coined a term meme, which is derived from the phonetic composition of the word gene. And it's this idea that there are units of thought or units of imitatable action that themselves are competing for access to minds. And that these memes are also evolving, and that you have memes that come into assembly with one another that are referred to as memeplexes. And that all of these memeplexes then have a certain type of competition for their own survival. This is pointing now to a dichotomy that we can refer to as bottom-up dynamics versus top-down dynamics. bottom-up dynamics means that you have a physical process like neurons firing in the brain, and then based on something at a, quote, low level of physical occurrence, that you can have a full causal representation for what's happening at a higher level. So the reason why I find my relationship with my husband meaningful can be fully explained if I just have an exquisitely precise map of all the neurons in my brain and how they're firing. In the other direction, top-down dynamics relate to this idea that, okay, once you have a certain complexity that emerges from the bottom up, it takes on a life of its own, and it starts to have its own set of rules. And so this is really beautifully articulated by a philosopher named Nancy Murphy. And this, in general, is referred to as emergentism. The idea, again, that you have dynamics that emerge from lower sets of rules, but once they reach a sufficient degree of complexity, that you have to look at what rules are now developed in that higher order system. That you can't explain the election of Hillary Clinton by particle physics. The election, oh my gosh, wishful thinking. That was like such a Freudian slip. You can't, well, let's try that again in the sad real world. You can't explain the election of Donald Trump with particle physics alone. Okay. So emergentism, bottom-up versus top-down dynamics. So really in the West, and I put the West in quotes because it's a really, really problematic term that renders invisible indigenous populations and all sorts of paradigms that don't fit into this assumed monolithic paradigm that we call the Western mind. That said, so the party in the West today is really drunk on materialism. And if you're committed to materialism, which most scientists are, then you really need to make space for this type of non-reductive physicalism or emergentism. Otherwise, I strongly will argue that you're going to miss huge swaths of explanatory power for the physical world around us. In his book On the Soul, Aristotle brilliantly packed emergentist thought into his ancient writings. And this is so stunning to me how prescient and ahead of his time Aristotle was. This concept of emergentism was not formally articulated until late into modernity, into the 20th and 21st century even, that this idea of emergentism is still fighting for traction in some places. And yet, thousands and thousands of years ago, Aristotle is not just lightly referring to a concept that we could identify with emergentism, but he's giving these maps of the components that work together and how it is that these lower components give rise to new phenomena.
Could you explain emergentism again?
Sure. Yep, you bet. So let's take, for example, the relationship between physics and chemistry. So in physics, there's a set of 5 fundamental forces, like the electromagnetic force, the force of gravity, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force. But if that were sufficient to explain the way that molecules bond with each other, the way that life emerges from biochemical configurations, then we wouldn't need chemistry departments or biology departments. But the fact that once those 5 forces have a sufficient level of complexity in the material history for what they've pushed around, then we have to look at the rules of chemistry. Similarly, chemistry gives rise to the rules of biology. Then you could also keep going up the ladder and say, okay, biology gives rise to the rules of psychology. But you can't just use physics alone and then expect to have a comprehensive understanding of psychology. You know, if an individual is in psychological distress, they don't go see a particle physicist. Finger snaps or foot stomps? Or do we need to talk a little more about that? We're okay for now? Okay. Cool. Aristotle divides the soul into components that are rendered in English as the faculties. And what's really, really beautiful is that he describes the soul not just of humans, but of non-human animals, of plants, and even of insects. And it was very sweet, I think, when I was first reading the De Anima, to be contemplating about the souls of insects. And then it just naturally changed the way, like when a little fly flew in, I was like, hello, little souled being, like it just fundamentally changed my relationship with how I saw other life forms, to think of them as fellow ensouled matter. So you've got the basic faculties of souls, such as the nutritive and the motive faculties. And so plants, they have a nutritive faculty with the root systems. You could argue that they've got some primordial motive faculty with the way that they can bend phototropically. And then you get to more advanced faculties, such as the sensitive faculty, our ability to perceive sight, smell, touch, taste, sound. The appetitive faculty, which Aristotle also describes as emergent from the sensitive faculty. And in short, the appetitive faculty is the compilation of our desires, of our drives, of our passions. The intellective faculty, which is the seat of reason, the seat of logic. And then the imaginative faculty, which is described as the faculty that perceives the invisibly real. All these working in concert with one another give rise to something then that is greater than just the sum of their parts. And in a similar way, going back to our chemistry analogy here with emergent properties, in the same way that you can't necessarily just look at oxygen in isolation and hydrogen in isolation and anticipate the qualities and the properties that a water molecule will have. You can't just look at individual faculties of soul in isolation and anticipate the properties and the qualities that the soul will emergently have as these faculties are coordinated successfully with one another. I like the snaps. Interim summary requests. Oh, yes. Perfect.
Yes, for that emergent property, which is the, let's say, the overarching, I don't want to use terms like entity, but let's say property. I hate to use that term too because it's very materialistic.
Yeah.
But whatever we may call it, some have, in the modern era, called it subjectivity. Mm-hmm. And some have called it consciousness. Could you distinguish between your use of the term soul and those two terms, subjectivity and or consciousness?
Sure. So subjectivity and consciousness are about the user interface. It's about the experience. It's about the observer who is observing the phenomenon and what it is that they're witnessing. Whereas soul, as we're going to get into a little bit more in detail here, is inclusive of the force that is pushing us toward our developmental potential. So soul is a broader concept than the user interface.
So it's got teleology attached.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
One more question.
Sure.
This goes back to sort of maybe attempting to define what is soul.
Mm-hmm.
So if soul is something that emerges from those qualities that you went over, are we making the assumption that soul is something that must emerge from all these qualities being present and interacting? Like, is it like looking at oxygen and hydrogen and saying these two must combine to form water?
Mm-hmm.
But if they do or if they don't, it's sort of like it's based on evidence, and yet soul is the one thing that is very difficult to gather any evidence for.
Mm-hmm.
If you could just comment on that.
Sure. Some of the requests. Oh, yes. Perfect.
Sure.
Sure. So let me try to like parse that apart here. So in essence, what I hear you asking is whether we can engineer souls. If it's like, okay, well, if this is what the intellective faculty does and this is what the imaginative faculty does, then we could create a synthetic soul that has like an intellective motherboard and an imaginative motherboard and a sensitive motherboard and an appetitive motherboard, and then like connect those motherboards together and, oh, look, it's the synthetic soul. Like, is that like a good kind of translational framing of what you're getting at here?
It's part of it. The other part is just that are we assuming that soul is something that immediately emerges from this? Like, does it always have to emerge? What if it doesn't?
Mm-hmm. Right, and so I'm trying to think of like real material world examples, and my mind is going to like, no, that's good. My mind is going to AI and robotics, because I think that that's like maybe the most like tangible parallel for this. That like if we can say, okay, here's what qualifies as an imaginative faculty, and then we create some sort of algorithm with deep learning that has an imagination. I mean, I don't know what that would look like, but let's qualify it, say that we achieve that, and then do that for each of these other faculties. Like, would necessarily then what arises from those coordinated with one another be soul? And I would say no, and I think Aristotle would also say no, and we're going to get into that. So in Book 3, Chapter 5, Aristotle talks about the sneaky little thing called the nous poietikos. Greek words. And we're going to get into exactly what that is. So great question, and let's hold that thought for when we get to the nous poietikos. All right, shifting gears and into contemporary science. I spend my time working with something called the human connectome. The human connectome was a jargonized term that, again, was mimicking the verbal construction of the human genome. In the 1990s, when we were sequencing DNA that was, widely popularized by Jurassic Park, the movies series, we started to realize as a scientific community that we cannot just understand the genetic code of humans as this collection of individual blueprints called genes. That there's something wildly complicated that's happening with the interactions of genes across this set of biological blueprints. And so the term genome was coined to try and acknowledge that there is an integrated system that has to be understood for its own internal rules above and beyond just the individual genes themselves. Now, in parallel with that thought, the connectome is this idea that the connections in the human brain are inadequately described just as these pairwise, synaptic, one-to-one information channels. That we have to take the whole system and realize that when something pushes here, it causes 5 million things to push over here. And it makes the problem of reverse engineering the brain staggering. It also means that neuroscientists will probably be employed for quite a while, which is good news for me. When we're talking about the human connectome, there's a few different levels that we're talking about it on. One of them is the physical connectome. And so this middle diagram here is an image that's produced from a technique called diffusion tensor imaging. And diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI, is an effort to show where the physical wires, the white matter, the axons, where they're running back and forth. It's the circuit board. Now we've also got the functional connectome. And that's depicted by this image on your far right. And the functional connectome is the map of what is activated correlationally with one another, and how do these activations cause other regions to become activated. When we were first, and when I say we, I mean when neuroscientists at first were looking at these different dimensions of neural imaging, so the DTI physical dimension, and then typically the fMRI, the functional magnetic resonance imaging level of activity patterns, we expected that we would see a very clean one-to-one map, such that, well, we can predict the functional connectome from the physical connectome. Boy, were we wrong. And we were so wrong that we still don't know why we're wrong. Part of it is likely because we don't have the physical connectome resolved to a fine enough level of detail. But a greater portion of the divergence is most likely understood by, again, the wild complexity. When we're talking about one cell that has connections to thousands of other cells, suddenly it almost becomes an intractable problem to try and understand cause and effect mechanisms across the brain. We also have these things called polysynaptic connections, such that it's not as simple as saying, like, oh, this spot is wired to this spot, so now if this spot pulses, the spot it's wired to is going to pulse. We have regions that are functionally related, but could have 3, 4, 5 relay stations in between them. And each of those synapses in between can have veto power and say, I'm not propagating that signal. And so then you have this other aspect of the complexity for understanding how it is that the functional patterns are related to the raw physical patterns. This right here is a representation, like I said, of the functional connectome. You've got, in a graph theory approach, nodes, which are represented by these red dots, and edges, which are the connections between the nodes. The connection strengths between each node can be quantified. What we do then, mathematically, is put this graph from an anatomical, three-dimensional organ into a two-dimensional matrix. So imagine that each of these red dots, each of these nodes, is numbered. What we can then do is look at the edge, look at these blue connecting lines as a cell in our matrix and say, okay, I want to know how strongly is region 1 connected with region 300. And then I can look at the cell in that matrix and see what the quantified value is representing the strength of that connection, of that edge. So if we've got 361, which is the number that I worked with in one of my publications, 361 nodes of interest, 361 regions of interest, we call them ROIs for short. Then the matrix representing the interactions of those ROIs with one another is going to be a 361 by 361 square matrix, where every element in that matrix is representing an edge in the network. Once we have a square matrix, we can do some really cool things with linear algebra. And this is the part where people are starting to twitch and have PTSD from math class when they had a really horrible teacher. And I'm so sorry for that. Math is wonderful, guys. With linear algebra, we can take a matrix and we can decompose it. We can do this beautiful transformation called an eigendecomposition. And we can derive from it what are called the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues. And the eigenvectors are descriptions of the principal components that are driving the variation in our matrix of interest. The eigenvalues then represent how much each individual eigenvector accounts for an aspect of variation in our matrix. So using that functional connectome matrix as our input data, we can run an eigendecomposition, derive from it a set of eigenvectors, which represent the principal functional components of the brain, and also have a series of eigenvalues that tell us how strongly each eigenvector is contributing to the pattern in the system. This is a paper that I published. This data is from a paper that I published in an MIT journal called Network Neuroscience. And it turns out that the top components that come out of that mathematical decomposition are recognizable functional networks. Also, it turns out that across a large data sample, this was in a population of 600 healthy control adults, that there's amazing consistency of these networks. In other words, there is a normative connectome. There is an operating platform that most people share that creates the emergent functions of their mind from the basis of their brain. And you can see that in particular, these first three components have a very high degree of homogeneity. When you start to see more variations in the color bars here, what that's reflecting is that there's more variation person to person in the profile of those later components in their brain. But the first three fundamental components of the functional brain have an amazing degree of similarity across this population. Now, as I mentioned, yes?
You mentioned earlier that to reverse engineer the system, and I'm thinking of such applications as a hope for cognitive science, to build a computer that has a functional consciousness, as we may put it, is hideously complex. And I'm wondering whether what you're talking about now has also been mapped onto our closest mammalian cousins, be they chimps or other higher mammals like dolphins and such, and whether we share some of that. And then also, what a reverse engineering might look like all the way down to, well, I don't know, fruit flies or worms with mighty big axons. How much of that is really a reflection of the, ever-evolving, ever-interacting process through time of the organism within its species and its ever-changing environment, and how that might look like, how much of that is, environment fed. I have to confess I'm a rock rib reductionist materialist. I tend to look to, such, sciences originated in philosophy like behaviorism, and that interaction. And so how much is the brain part of the complex of, the organism surviving and attempting to replicate its environment, and how much we share with other close higher mammal cousins, and what that would look like, rather than just humans alone?
Mm-hmm. Yep, great question. So when we do comparative neuroanatomy and comparative functional anatomy, we see also striking preservation of these networks and of their configurations relative to one another. And so looking at these first three, I'll just populate these. The sensory cortex is preserved across all mammals. That we've got a very similar sensory motor profile, and this is what enables us to do basic research on motor diseases in rats and mice, and then have it translate into something that's meaningful for human biology. Within the past decade to decade and a half, the new guy on the block, or gal on the block, I don't mean to gender the brain networks, is the default mode network here. And there was an issue of the New Scientist, which is a popular science magazine, that had this beautiful cover picture of the default network, and it said the brain's dark network, because it was so mysterious as to what its base function was. And yet we see it as the second dominant component in the functional architecture of the brain. It turns out that the default network is crucial for mental simulations. So anything like theory of mind, where if I'm now trying to estimate what you're thinking about what I'm thinking, I'm creating these simulations of your mental content. That's supported largely by the default network. Also, prospective thought. So if I'm trying to imagine, what's my husband going to say when we get home from this? That would be a simulation that I would be running based on my memories of his past behaviors, based on my memories of how his behaviors have been in response to different stimuli, and then I'll be simulating a prospective, a forward-thinking estimate of what I anticipate that his behaviors will be. So again, things like theory of mind, empathy, the capacity for fellow feeling is largely supported by the default network. So across mammals, and mammals are very noted for their bonding and attachment behaviors. Our ability to bond and to attach largely is driven by our ability to simulate the inner life of another organism. Then the frontoparietal network would be one where you would start to see more speciation, literally, from our nearest primate friends. So the frontoparietal network is involved in goal-oriented behavior, in conscious, controlled intellection. The frontoparietal network is central for intelligence. And since, as a species, one of our evolutionary add-ons was this enlarged frontal cortex, that goes part and parcel with this so frontal because it's the frontal cortex. The parietal cortex is this part of the brain in front of the visual cortex and above the temporal cortex. So in humans and Homo sapiens compared to chimpanzees, we have a lot more real estate in that frontal lobe, such that the frontoparietal network is going to be more developed in humans than it is in other species.
It's sort of like the peacock's tail as opposed to other birds.
Possibly. If we hash that out, possibly. And I'll leave it at that for now. We can talk about that. Yeah. Okay.
Physically map the emergence of creativity and also find out what the causes of emergence are, organizationally in terms of patterns and principles. And if so, can we induce this physically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. A lot of people are working on what are the physical substrates of creativity. And there's a wonderful website that all of you as seekers and citizen scientists can go to that's called Neurosynth, Neurosynth. I believe it's .org. Someone can spot me if they want to. But it has a terrific search interface where you can type in a term like creativity, and then it'll populate images of the brain. And it's a meta-analysis that it's drawing from Google Scholar. It's drawing from these large databases of other scientists' findings. And it's saying, okay, across the dozens and dozens of fMRI brain imaging studies on creativity, what is common across all of those? So it's looking at a meta-analytical approach. And it turns out that with creativity, it's largely related to centers of the brain that are involved in memory, like the hippocampus. So our creativity, it seems, is this chaotic recombination of memory fragments to find new forms and new solutions. So, when you're sleeping and your prefrontal cortex is functionally relating differently to your hippocampus, which is orchestrating your memories, you've got a different pattern of chaos in the way that memory traces are fusing into one another. And that's, causally one reason why some people have these aha epiphanies while they're sleeping, because of that chaotic recombination of what's in their memory repositories. Same thing with psychedelic drugs, that it's changing the way that your frontal cortex is inhibiting or restraining or consolidating memories and allowing this window of chaos for your memory content to fuse together into different thought forms. As far as the bottom-up explanation of emergentism, that'll be a different lecture night. So to refresh your memory here, revisiting the faculties that Aristotle talks about, and particularly these higher faculties of the sensitive, appetitive, intellective, and imaginative aspects of the soul. These map on with mind-blowing correlation to what we're deriving from our highest technical approaches to mapping the functions of the human brain, such that the fundamental sensory cortical configuration is very correspondent to the sensitive faculty. The default mode network that I was just talking about is involved in supporting mental simulation. Bears a lot of relationship with what Aristotle talks about with the imaginative faculty as being the perceiver of invisible realities. And then the frontoparietal network, as I'll show in just another few slides here, is the gateway into our intelligible cognitive processes. So, I mean, sit with this for a second. That thousands and thousands of years before we had the first human go into an fMRI scanner to look at how their brain is coordinated and orchestrated, we've got this guy in Greece who is saying, well, by way of introspection and analysis, I'm going to derive this map that is anticipating what neuroscience is going to assemble thousands of years later. I want to listen to him now. Like, what else does he have to say? There are some misconceptions and some modern criticisms that get leveled at Aristotle, and particularly the way that he describes the brain, that I think are really unfair. And I take it like personally. I'm like, I want to like start throwing down with people when they start coming for Aristotle. So the brain, he talks about it being an organ that is a refrigerator. And it sounds super weird to us today. But one of the reasons why it sounds super weird to us is because we're misunderstanding the sense in which Aristotle is evoking the concepts of hot and of cold. So just for simplification, think of cold as order and think of hot as chaos. There's a lot more to it, but like just to move the discussion forward, think of those as simplified approximations here. So now one of the things that I did was I looked at the way that variations in these brain networks across this population of 600 healthy control adults is related to variations in cognitive traits such as intelligence. And what I observed was that the internal synchrony of a network, or in other words, how well orchestrated the default mode is with itself, or how well orchestrated the frontoparietal network is with itself, are predictive of these variations in cognitive traits and of personality traits. Specifically, the internal synchrony for components 3 through 10, 3 once again being the frontoparietal network, are predictive of fluid intelligence, which is the capacity to complete patterns and to do abstraction of thought. So think about what this means, that the intelligent brain is a cold brain, quotes around cold, meaning ordered, that the more internally ordered these networks are, the more intelligent that brain is. Also, when Aristotle talks about the brain being a cooling system for the blood, he wasn't talking about thermoregulation and heat. We know now through modern medicine and modern physiology that there are these robust systems between the activity of the brain and between the way that stress hormones are released through the bloodstream. Those then in turn affect the efficacy of the immune system. So you've got an aspect of the hippocampus that's called the subiculum. Like we were talking about, the hippocampus is involved in memory and as well as mental simulation that regulates another brain region called the hypothalamus. And then you've got this downward cascade where in the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary gland regulates your adrenal glands. And by this cascade of physical causes, your blood becomes more saturated with stress hormones. But if you have your mental simulation working in such a way that you're down-regulating that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, then you're conserving stress hormones and you're not dumping them into your bloodstream. And the way that stress feels to me, it's not difficult at all to conceptualize that as like hot blood versus cold blood. For those of you who were at meditation with Leandro, you were using your brain as a reduction techniques, which are increasingly gaining more and more appreciation and respect, even within the most cynical and skeptical medical materialists. Yeah, I'll snap to that too. So a rule of thumb that you can take to the bank is that if there is a tension wherein Aristotle is accused of being idiot, the more likely scenario is that the accuser is actually the idiot. A recurring philosophical strategy of Aristotle is to look at the dichotomy of potential reality and actual reality. And now this is going to get into some of the questions about, what is there beyond consciousness that is constituting soul in Aristotle's definition here. So in the potentialized versus the actualized, an example that Aristotle uses is an acorn and an oak tree. And so in these, which is the potentialized matter? Is it the acorn or the oak? The acorn, correct, represents the potentialized matter, and then it's actualized into the oak tree. So, what is an issue politically for which this might be an important philosophical distinction? Yeah. We're talking seriously about when life begins. We have to acknowledge that there's a distinction between the potentialization of personhood that occurs at conception versus the actualization of personhood that does not occur at conception. There's a list of 5 key terms that I would like everyone in this room to feel comfortable and familiar and chill with, have like a cool refrigerated brain when they hear these terms. And at first they're going to sound like Greek to you because they literally are Greek. The first of these is hylomorphism. Let's all say it together, hylomorphism. Feel it roll off your tongue. Telos. You're good, you pick up fast. Entelechy. Nous poietikos. And eudaimonia. Beautiful. Hylomorphism is the principle that form is what leads to function. And so I did my bachelor's degree in biochemistry, and this was a mantra that if you want to understand the way that receptors in cells are functioning, you have to understand the form of those receptors. The metaphor that Aristotle uses repeatedly here is the relationship between a ball of wax and a seal that's pressed into the wax. And because for Aristotle, the soul is emergent from the form, it's incoherent. It doesn't make any sense to talk about a disembodied soul. Telos, we're talking about the actualized form of a potentialized matter. So the telos of an acorn is an oak tree. Entelechy then is the force driving the development toward the telos. So this is where and we're not going to be able to get into all of the juicy, wonderful detail about reverse temporal causation, or in other words, the future pulling us toward it. But by way of analogy, think of our telos of our potential form as a point charge in space. And that telos is pulling us toward our potential form. In that metaphor, then, the electric field that is drawing toward that point charge would be the entelechy. The nous poietikos, like I mentioned, this comes in book 3 and is far and away the most debated concept within Aristotle's construction of the soul. Largely because after going through so much drama of how soul is embodied and how it's incomprehensible to talk about a disembodied soul, then he slips in that the nous poietikos is this immaterial aspect of the soul. And you're like, whoa, we just spent the last several books talking about how everything was materialized and embodied, and now here's this thing that he says is not embodied or that it's not material. So it becomes very, very, very controversial as to what his intent actually was. Nous poieticos is typically rendered in English as the active intellect. And active is related to actualized. So in contrast to the active intellect, you have the potential intellect. The Aristotelian view of normative adult development, then, is that of transforming a passive intellect into an active intellect. Thinking about this in maybe another angle of entry for the lights to come on more broadly here, the nous, the mind, is a recipient of memes if an individual has a passive intellect. But the nous, the mind, is a generator, a creator of memes if an individual has developed sufficiently and thus acquired a state of active intellection. I think, and I would like to argue this formally at some point, I think that what Aristotle is referring to as the nous poieticos is very closely related to what Daniel Dennett is elaborating in memetics, in meme theory. And in his most recent book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, Dennett lays out this landscape wherein we are not creating reasons, we're not creating logical explanations, that we're discovering them. That reasons and explanations exist and that we're realizing them as opposed to generating them. So you can think of the nous poieticos in that concept as an active scout for undiscovered reasons. Yeah.
Can you more closely define, not necessarily the way Dennett explains it, but let's say in your take on it, can you more closely define the term reasons? And I'm thinking, starting with basic mathematical propositions, as much beloved by the ancient Greeks all the way back to Pythagoras, which are self-evident, but, bumping along to it is possibly self-evident that whoever it is that one doesn't like in the American political scene is self-evidently wrong, etc. Yeah. And how would you define it?
Yeah, so I would ground that in Aristotle's categories of causes again. So reasons being causes, and so we typically think with the scientific mathematical paradigm of the material element of causes. So we're like, because of this quantity of force that was applied to this quantity of matter, there was this quantity of a physical effect. And so I do think, like you're saying, that's one preliminary level of discovering pre-existing, self-existing reasons. So if we start going up that ladder of causes, all the way up to the efficient cause or to the final cause, which material science doesn't even consider that. It's not even within the rubric for material science to be analyzing any telos or final cause that might or might not exist. I understand Dennett to be saying that to the degree that there are final causes or not, that those are self-existent. So this would be a challenge, as I understand it, to kind of a liberal existentialism, where we have the intrinsic power to author the reasons of our existence.
So deterministic.
That becomes problematic because you can still have chaos, which is fundamentally opposed to determinism, in an attractor field where if there's going back to that point charge analogy again, the reason could be the point charge and it's gravitating something toward it, but you can still have chaos that's not predicting every maneuver in that system. Okay, and then the last term here, Eudaimonia, which is literally good-spiritedness. It's, maybe some other time we can chat about this over beers, whether or not Aristotle was a supernaturalist Like in his Eudaimonia Ethics, he talks about that one of the 5 aspects that's essential for a person to have a flourishing life is like the nymphs and the spirits have to like be on their side. And you're like, what? But with good spiritedness, think about it as a sense of profound, rich happiness and satisfaction that's more than just a subjective ecstasy of being, but that it's grounded in the fact that you're thriving and that you're flourishing. That like the spirits, so to speak, that are possessing you are good ones. You've got good genies on your side calling the shots. A huge aspect of eudaimonia is developing virtues as habits. And so the concept of virtues becomes a very rich set of discussions in his writings on ethics. Yeah.
Brings up the question in my mind, I've heard it said that awe is the gateway to compassion, and there's some research in the field of positive psychology that would suggest that people who spend time in awe are in greater compassion, have greater acts of compassion and so forth. So would that relate to eudaimonia, and is there any way that people in your field can measure that, can see that in looking at and studying the brain?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question. I don't have it in my slide deck here, but if you go onto YouTube at some point and type in, "This is your brain on God," Michael Ferguson, my name, then I gave a TEDx talk that's related to this topic. What I did as part of my graduate studies was I took believing Mormons. So these are people who are like in it to win it. They're paying 10% of their money to the church in forms of tithing. They committed 2 years of their lives to being a full-time missionary, knocking on doors. "Hello, my name is Elder da 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 da." For those of you who have seen Book of Mormon the musical. And while they were inside of an fMRI scanner, we had them read the Book of Mormon. We had them watch videos of their prophets preaching sermons. We had them praying. And they would push a button, like literally tap a button, when they said that they felt the Spirit of God descend upon them. Now, the subjective description of that feeling of the Spirit is this feeling of like transcendent awe, transcendent connection with the numinous. We did a little behavioral test on them where we had them rate in-group and out-group members at the very beginning of their devotional prayer scripture study session. And then we had them rate in-group and out-group members at the end of their devotional prayer scripture study session when they had been indicating intense experiences of this type of awe or like, transcendent emotion. And it turns out that the effect was such that this period of religious and spiritual awe caused them to be more generous in their appraisals of out-group individuals. So so those dynamics of transcendent awe and compassion do seem to have some relationship that's causal in nature. And I think that field of, mystical neuroscience or positive psychology, I think that there's a lot to be discovered there. All right, so a selection of key terms, just to run down these again. Hylomorphism, who wants to be brave, and at the very least, point to which one of these pictures represents the concept of hylomorphism. Yeah. That's right. Yep, the stamp. This idea that our form is stamped into our material existence, and that is what's intrinsic for the properties that we describe as soulful. And then what about telos? And what's the gist of the telos? What is that referencing? That's right. Yeah, it's a potential that matter can become. Then entelechy. That's right. It's the electric charge. It's like that force that's pushing us toward our potential. And then how about Eudaimonia? Oh, I skipped Nous Poieticos. What about Nous Poieticos? How could I? Yeah, so the Nous Poieticos, I garbled those up here. Nous Poieticos is the active intellect, so it's the feather of the hand that's writing. And then the Eudaimonia is that rich happiness where you're just like, oh my gosh, the spirits are so good to me. So after Aristotle, you had a lot of really, really massive thought leaders who picked up his writings on the soul and started to take them in these divergent paths. Thomas Aquinas based a lot from his Summa Theologica on Aristotle's writings about the soul. In particular, when when Aquinas is talking about prayer, he talks about this divine conjunction between the transcendent entity and the human being as a product of the appetitive faculty. And so this is one of the reasons why in so much Catholic symbolism that you see the heart really glorified, representing like the appetite, that it's like, oh, you have to like hunger for Jesus and hunger for communion with Mary and with the saints. That it's very much the desire, and where the desire is leading you, that represents your conjunction with the divine. Then in the Arabic philosophical tradition, you have Avicenna, among other amazing scholars, who assert that the seat of that divine conjunction between the transcendent and the human is in the intellective faculty as opposed to the appetitive faculty. And specifically, they elaborate greatly on the Nous Poieticos, on the active intellect, being the connection point between the transcendent divine and the human being. So, I mean, and this is an open question. I don't have a particular answer in mind, but when we get to the discussion at the very end here, I'd be interested in the thoughts that you guys have at a cultural level, at the ways in which some of these philosophical thought leaders may have primed the developments and the divergences and the complementarities that we see between these cultural groups. As one path of reconciliation between the way that Aquinas and the Arabic philosophers took the De Anima, I'm very interested in a kind of obscure set of texts written by a shadowy historical figure. We don't really know who it is. He's been called Pseudo-Dionysius because initially it was thought that he was Dionysius, one of the converts of the Christian Apostle Paul. In the 15th century, it was realized that, like, oh, this guy totally was pulling the wool over our eyes. And so pseudo, meaning, oh, he's not Dionysius, but we don't know who it is. So we're just going to say it's sort of Dionysius. And so I'm not at all saying that Pseudo-Dionysius was consciously reconciling these divergences in philosophy that would occur, 1,000 years or 500 to 1,000 years after he lived. But I am saying that in the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius that you have a beautiful synthesis of these two paths toward divine conjunction, such that Pseudo-Dionysius in his mystical theology talks about the path of love that leads to knowledge. And that sounds a lot like Aquinas, that it's the appetitive faculty that's the divine conjunction. Then he says that there's a path of knowledge that leads to love. And to me that sounds a lot like Avicenna when he's talking about it's the active intellect that is the locus for divine conjunction. But both culminate in this fusion that is rendered as an English compound word of loving wisdom.
I just wanted to mention that in Sufism, it's more love leading to knowledge. So you have both in the Islamic tradition. Very
cool. Thank you for clarifying that. And again, when we're talking about like billions of people, like these are very, very broad brushstrokes. And certainly you also have some Christian traditions that privilege intellection. But I appreciate that nuancing of these very broad categories. All right, so the last sequence here is to talk about soul in the clinic. As I mentioned, I'm working now at a teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School. And I'll be honest, a lot of my colleagues like detest that I'm even trying to bring like soul back. It's like the Justin Timberlake. It's like, I'm bringing soul back. Yeah. And those other mothers don't know how to act. No. So as a refresher, with Aristotle's 4 categories of causes, we were talking about material, formal, efficient, and final. And science is almost exclusively concerned with material and formal. It like shuns the efficient or the final cause. But I will assert for you friendly folks that having a sensible concept for the final cause of self is a neurobiological imperative. If you go to Google Scholar and do a search for purpose in life and clinical outcomes, there is study after study after study demonstrating very robustly that a person's sense of purpose and purposefulness in their life affects their outcomes, from everything to the way their kidneys function, to if they're going to recover from cancer, to more obvious connections like their mental and emotional health. There's something, and I'll use this very gingerly. There's something, I won't. I was going to say magical, but no, let's not indulge that. But there's something powerful, there's something efficacious, materially causal about the presence or the absence of a realized sense of purpose in an individual's life. One of the neuroscience investigations that I've done is taking a validated psychometric for meaning and purpose that asks questions such as, I understand my life's meaning, and then the study participant answers on a Likert scale, which is a 5-point scale ranging from I strongly disagree to I strongly agree. After they answer all these questions about how much meaning and purpose they experience, I sum up their total score. They get like a 1 value number for like how meaningful their life is. I know it's absurd. And then I look at the ways that this single value score of meaning and purpose experience relates to neural function. And it turns out that the meaningful brain, because it's full of meaning, is acting in the exact opposite dynamics as the lonely brain is acting. And it's suggestive that intersubjectivity, that the phenomena that we generate in relationship, is fundamentally instrumental in the actualization of meaningful existence. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if these studies have been conceived also as applicable to cross-cultural examination. It's been said in the West, the modern industrial West, post-industrial, that a sense of purpose largely in society has been lost because of our detachment from traditional religious meanings and narratives, which would have applied not only to the collective but also to each individual. I'm wondering if one were to examine somebody from a very traditional, possibly even what we would call primitive society that is still living in a mythic narrative, whether the need to enunciate a purpose in the face of apparent meaninglessness, in a cold, material, dead world, whether that's even necessary, whether this is more a symptom of a loss of mythic narrative for our particular society, and that could also come from, the clash of civilizations where narratives bump up against narratives and essentially cancel each other out. So I'm wondering if you could address that.
Sure. No, those are a great set of questions. We live today in, again, the West, as problematic of a term as that is, in what I will call a type 2 culture. And what I mean by that is a reference to statistical errors. We have a type 1 error or a type 2 error. A type 1 error in statistics is when you say, oh, there's nothing here. I'm sorry. A type 1 error is when you say, oh, there's something here. It's a false positive. So it's like, oh, you're diagnosed with cancer, but you don't have cancer. That would be a type 1 error. The type 2 error is a false negative. It's where there's something there, but we make the error of saying that there's not. You miss the diagnosis. For many and sundry reasons, the Enlightenment has pushed us into this place where, like, we refuse. It's like we're traumatized. We refuse to commit type 1 errors anymore. We're like, we are not going to say that something is there when it's not. We refuse. We refuse. But what we've done is we've just, like, thrown ourselves headlong into a sea of type 2 errors, to where it's ludicrous to even imagine a universe where the only things that exist are the small set of things that we have in our marble sack of material models. That's just silly. But we live locked into this culture where we're far more willing to engage a sea of type 2 errors than we are to make, like, a drop of type 1 errors. And so I would be highly interested to do these types of studies that you're talking about, where we have individuals who are from cultures that do not represent type 2 mentalities, and where, like, they're much more open to the invisible possibilities, and to see, okay, how is this now physically driving the way that their brain is wired and functional compared to someone who is immersed in a type 2 culture. Yeah.
But how do we consider that responsibly? Because sometimes I heard a lot, well, I keep my mind open to possibilities, and then we fall into pseudoscientific conclusions that are not based on any respectable science, but it's just like, it's just this wishful thinking, and just, it sounds cool.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm thinking of a lot of Facebook kind of pages that just are constantly feeding people with things that, it sounds pretty cool, and then when you go and you check the sources, it's just total nonsense.
Right, and so what that second part there is the key, that you check the sources. When it sounds cool, that you don't just say, like, yes, coolness, I feel cool, but that you engage the critical thought. So your own Jordan Peterson here at the University of Toronto, as problematic as some of his comments have been, he also does good science. He has a really beautiful piece with Colin DeYoung that talks about the spectrum from madness to genius. And he talks about the dynamic relationship between openness to new ideas versus intellective engagement with those ideas. And sort of, alchemically, so to speak, if a person's personality is oriented toward a high level of openness, that they're the type of person who is like, I want the new crystal Reiki treatment and it's going to, like, heal me of everything, and I'm kind of that person, I'll be honest. So, but if you have, like, high openness, that's great, but if the high openness does not have high intellective trait engagement, then that is a personality combination that is schizotypic, that it is much more conducive to psychosis and to delusion. Conversely, if you have a personality type where it's low openness to new ideas, but high on the intellective, critical side of engagement, that becomes this dogmatic, this authoritarian type of person. That the ideal is to strike in our development as individuals this balance of both high openness to the unknown and the invisible, coupled with high intellective engagement for the new concepts that we're being exposed to. And the personality psychology research asserts that it's that combination of high openness and high intellect that is most conducive to the emergence of genius. So, great question. All right, so existential philosophy in neurology? What? Those are not two disciplines that are typically paired, if ever. But I'm going to assert once again that being in a state of meaning deficit versus a state of meaning abundance is causally related to recovery from disease. Next generation interventions for recovery from meaning deficit disorders include things like deep brain stimulation as well as non-invasive brain stimulation. So let's talk for a brief moment here about deep brain stimulation. There's a wonderful medical scientist named Helen Mayberg who is doing groundbreaking work to treat depression that has not responded to cognitive behavioral therapy or to medication or to any number of attempted interventions. And the place where those crosshairs are located on the brain is the region of the subgenual cortex, as it's called, that is stimulated by electrodes, very fine electrodes that go through the cranium and through the neural tissue and then pulse electrical energy into that very focused area of the brain. And when she has performed these deep brain stimulation surgeries, her patients have reported, and keep in mind again, these are patients who have wrestled endlessly with this just feeling of despair and depression such that they wanted someone to drill into their head. Like, we're not talking about like just a typical bad day. And these individuals who have not had relief from crushing depression so that they experience sudden calmness or lightness, disappearance of the void, that's a very poignant description to me, and a feeling of connectedness. Work that I've done to look at the differences in the brains of individuals with meaning deficits versus meaning abundance have zeroed in on some core neurobiology. We've got broad swaths here of the prefrontal cortex that are implicated as being more active when an individual has states of meaning deficit, in addition to a region that's called the hippocampus, specifically the subicular hippocampus. We've talked about it a couple of times tonight, which it's crucially involved in episodic memories, in scene-based memories, as opposed to like fact-based memories, like, oh, the capital of France is Paris. Not that. Like episodes where you're reconstructing your experiences. And then another region called the anterior insula, which is involved in spontaneous attention. So spontaneous attention being like, if there's a loud crash, well, look to see what happened, as opposed to deliberate attention, which, like, if I'm writing a report, I'm using a different type of attention system than when I'm spontaneously responding to my environment. But in the case of individuals with meaning deficits, it's the hippocampus, the memory center, plus their spontaneous attention that are engaged with one another. So it's almost as if this person in a state of meaning deficit has a brain that is flipping through the Rolodex of their memories, trying to construct some sort of cohesive narrative identity. And narrative identity in the literature is defined as a person's internalized and evolving life story, integrating the reconstructed past and the imagined future to provide life with some degree of unity and purpose. In the opposite direction, if an individual is experiencing a state of meaning abundance, then there's a different set of neural regions that become more central in their functional anatomy. Zeroing away, so you've got the prefrontal cortex is involved in just lots of stuff, But if we zero to the most salient regions, there's a specific area of the prefrontal cortex, like if you touch the right side of your head, kind of above your eyebrow, that's what my results are indicating is crucial for tying together the sense that life has a cohesive unity and purpose. This region is nested right between a few different cellular types. So the Brodmann areas are descriptions of patches of different types of neurons across the brain, and they're numbered. And so this spot that my results are indicating is central for unifying a cohesive sense of life meaning is nested between Brodmann areas 10, represented in blue, and Brodmann areas 11 and 12, represented in yellow. And I don't know what it means yet. This is the forefront of my research. But it is very provocative to me that this spot that seems to be crucial for integrating and sustaining meaning is nested in between two different types of cellular architecture. because this region that's turning up in my results is so close to the front of the brain, it is accessible through non-invasive types of brain stimulation, such as a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And with transcranial magnetic stimulation, what's being done is that the magnetic wand here is placed on the target area of the brain, and focused electromagnetic pulses are oscillated at that region of interest in the brain. And what that does, depending on the frequency pattern that you're stimulating the brain at, it can either increase activity or it can decrease activity in that spot of the brain. So, and this is like, I mean, science, you guys, moves so slowly. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's not ridiculous. It's wonderful. That's why it's so great, because it's very careful and meticulous. But I'm the type of personality where I'm like, oh, good, we have the answer. Let's like go do this experiment and treat people now. Like, this has to be validated over and over and over and over, especially if we're talking about a patient population where we're planning some kind of new intervention. Like, so this, I mean, check back in like a decade and I'll tell you how this is going. But I feel so strongly motivated to integrate, again, this essence of existentialism with neuroscience and with patient care in order to promote at an organic biological level a platform where individuals are more likely to experience life as something that has an abundance of meaning and that is motivated. One of my dear heroes is Patricia Churchland, who is also from Canada. It's like the night of Canadian intellects tonight. Okay. But Patricia Churchland authored a groundbreaking book called Neurophilosophy, which now, in retrospect, might seem sort of obvious to say that, like, oh, if we want to understand the mind, we have to understand the brain. But I mean, you actually still have people who resist that, who say, why do we need to know anything about the brain? Let's just study the mind. And I'm like, ugh. Like, my brain explodes when they say that. But she really pushed forward this concept of unifying neuroscience as well as philosophy of mind into neurophilosophy. I had the chance to meet her. I totally fanboyed all over her. She was probably like, you're weird, back away slowly. No, she's gracious and fantastic. And what I really hope to do over the course of my career is to pick up this tradition of neurophilosophy and then take it to the next rung on this ladder of intellectual ascent and create a translational neurophilosophy where now, again, we're integrating clinical interventions in order to help people live their best lives, both philosophically as well as physically. So in summary, the De Anima, Aristotle's treatise on the soul, has had wild influence throughout Christianity, Islam, and even secular science. The soul can be defined with deceptive simplicity as that which causes animation of the body. And then, as good as Aristotelians, we can look at that from 4 different categories of causes: material causes of animation, formal causes, efficient causes, and final causes. We can look at the components of the soul as discrete faculties, and then the functions of these faculties with one another as giving rise to an emergent new set of qualities and properties of soulishness. The principal components of the resting state, typical brain in humans, bear a beautiful correspondence to these faculties that Aristotle articulated thousands and thousands of years before we had anybody inside of a neural imaging machine. And Aristotle gives us some wonderful concepts that we can deploy both to introspect as well as to begin to actively engineer and engage a more thriving style of life for ourselves. The concept of hylomorphism, that our form leads to our function. I mean, one of the reasons why, even though we all know that physical exercise is one of the best ways to become happier, it's harder to do than to understand. Telos, the concept that, like, we have some actualizable future away from a passive intellect and toward an active intellect. All of this culminating in eudaimonia, in good-spiritedness, in possession by whatever genies or nymphs Aristotle was writing about phenomenologically, and then experiencing life as something that is wonderful and that we thrive to experience. My hope is that we do move toward an age of translational neurophilosophy where the fact that it sounds so weird right now to talk about soul and medicine in one conversation is no longer weird in 50 years from now. And if you like this kind of thing, I am working on getting a podcast up and going. It's called the Luminous Brain Podcast. You can access it through luminousbrain.com. In about a week and a half, it should be a slicked and well-oiled machine. I'm also going to be launching Luminous Brain weekend retreats, including one here at Center Place in Toronto that will be an integration of music, art, science, and philosophy in community, where we'll have art instructors who will be taking us through watercolor and sculpture, we'll have musicians, we'll have scientific presentations, wonderful philosophical discussions, and of course, tasty food with great people. Dates are to be determined there, but please, I would love to have your email address if this is something that you would like to stay informed about moving forward. And I want to end with a song, speaking of music, that Leandro is going to play. Is that all systems cool there? Okay. This is a song I wrote with one of my buddies, Charlie.
Come be my Holy Ghost. Oh, pray the nation toils, treasures that are lost. Let's restore them all and shine, shine, shine. Let your light so shine, shine, shine. Master of my soul, master of my mind, Logos revive, shine, shine, shine in the sun.
Quick thank yous to John Hamer, who is like such a beautiful mentor to me, and I can't look at him, otherwise I'll get emotional right now. And then also to my husband, John Seth Anderson, who is my sidekick and and my soulmate in the truest sense. So any questions?
I've got a two-part question.
All right.
And part A is more an opinion on your end. So when we're looking at this neurological study and you're doing the research in connection with Aristotle's philosophy of the brain, when we get into things like degenerative diseases, be it dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever, in your opinion, then, is the person losing parts of their soul because they are losing memory? They are, the brain is degenerating. Would the dementia be actually attacking the nous poeticos portion first so that they do not have that cognitive recognition anymore. So that's part A. Part B is, with this research, are we looking at potentially doing something in the future where not just, say, curing dementia, but perhaps stalling it so that we can keep parts of the soul, keep parts of the recognition by saying, okay, these nodes here, we can sort of reroute, you know, whatever, you know, active ingredient, so that we can actually maybe look at a person and say, okay, well, we can still save part of their soul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Aristotle talks in very subtle terms about soul, in one sense, being fixed, and that it's less that the soul is moving, but that it's that our being is moving toward or away from our soul. So in that particular nuanced sense, it wouldn't necessarily be that we're losing our soul, but that we're moving in relation to our soul to a less actualized state. And then I'm also thinking, so I think it's Aquinas, talks about how friends are second souls. And so with the death of a friend, that you're losing your second soul. Now, the second question, or the second part of your question was with regard to interventions. Help me understand the point, not the point in a rude way, but like what's the question again? Because certainly, yes, we're actively looking for ways to fight degenerative disease.
So when you're mapping, for example, and all your charts, and you're looking at all the different nodes and the connections between them and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then you're mapping the front part of the brain and that little spot just above the right eyebrow and that. When it comes to degenerative diseases, are we, or is the possibility that we could say, okay, we know that the brain is degenerating, perhaps we could reroute some of those nodes so that, you know, this part's going to degenerate, but we can then sort of still save part of the soul or whatever, or reroute it so that the person doesn't just become, you know, a complete degenerated materialism.
Sure. So a couple of answers to that, to treatment strategies that are in the pipeline. One, like I mentioned, is the great promise that things like transcranial magnetic stimulation are showing, these non-invasive brain stimulation methods that appear to be causing neurogenesis, or in other words, like growth of cortical tissue. So if you have an area of the brain that you can visualize as deteriorating or thinning, then you can use that as a treatment target to say, okay, now let's stimulate it in order to combat that course of degeneration. That's one approach. Another is the growing recognition that the brain is fundamentally a push-pull system. So let's think about muscles as an example, that the whole musculature of the body is a push-pull system. And so if I can't bend my bicep, one reason might be because my bicep isn't flexing. Another reason could be that it's that my tricep is so hyperflexed that it's not allowing my bicep to bend. And so there's also really cutting-edge, counterintuitive work to map out the push-pull dual systems as sets, such that if there is a degeneration occurring where, again, in this metaphor, I'm not able to flex my bicep, rather than like stimulating it and saying, oh, we're going to make your bicep enormous, we're going to actually intentionally cause a deficit in my tricep to restore function there. And so again, these are the forefront of surgical interventions that are being studied. But the idea being, if we can strategically disrupt function in one system, we might be able to restore function in another.
Hi, thanks for your lecture. The lady next to me had made a comment early about if you had all the right components together, would a soul generate from that?
Yeah.
Which leads me immediately to think about cloning.
Right.
So we've got Dolly, and we've got Dolly's new twin.
Yeah.
Does Dolly's new twin have a soul?
I think so.
And does that only apply for lower forms?
So great questions. I don't know the answers, but I can tell you what I think here. And we see this, in cloning plants. Like if we go at the level of just splitting a root from a plant, they're identical genetically. At what point do they become different souls? The way that I think about it largely has to do with each body. Again, if we're taking seriously this hylomorphic idea that form is what gives rise to the function of soul, that by virtue of being two independent bodily systems, that you've now got two different trajectories there for those bodies, and as soon as those two bodies start having two different sets of experiences, they start to have different forms physically. The synapses, the molecular composition of their memory systems are diverging such that their forms are no longer identical. Their genetic basis might be identical, but the actual physical structure over the course of experience starts to deviate. And again, then this becomes really, really, really tricky conversation about ultimately what do we mean by soul? Has their telos at that point changed? Like I said, I'm very, very fascinated by the mystical theology of Pseudo-Dionysius. And it's not that, and I have a really hard time conveying that I don't think that it's a departure from natural science, because explicitly Pseudo-Dionysius says over and over again, mystical symbols should not be taken literally. So in his writings, when Pseudo-Dionysius says that there's 10,000 times 10,000 angels, I interpret that as meaning that there's 10,000 times 10,000 forms of telos. And even running the numbers, at the time that he was living, that was probably the entirety of the population. That I think that he was trying to communicate in his mystical philosophy that there's an infinite teleological universe that we inhabit. Yeah, you bet.
I don't know if you touched on this in the first half hour because I wasn't here, but if you have, then sorry. But if you haven't, maybe you can address this. I've read that studies have been done that showed that the brain actually lost a number of grams after death, and they attributed that to soul. Have you read about this?
I've not. I personally haven't seen any place where that's been measured reputably, which is not to say that I'm being a type 2 culturalist and saying that no, this isn't possible. I personally have never seen a study where it was sufficiently rigorous scientific conditions that it was a reproduced.
Yeah, that was really my question, because I know I've read about this as a result that some scientist had found in the past, and I read it a while ago and I don't remember the reference, so it's just something that remains in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly that's been popularized. There's been, I think there was a movie called 8 grams even. 21. But as far as reproduced physical demonstrations, I don't know of any. But I'd be super happy if someone else does, and I'm, like I said, I don't want to be a type 2
Okay,
culturalist.
can I tell you something else that was done?
Yeah.
I actually saw a film at the Hot Docs Festival, and what it was they opened up the crypt of a world-famous architect whose name was Louis Barragan, who had won the Pritzker Prize of Architecture, and he was a great, iconic architect. And a woman had got total access to his archives, and she wouldn't let anybody else in. So other researchers have decided that they tried to find a way, perhaps, of enticing this woman to open the archives. So this is what they did. They went to Barragan's family and asked if they could take out 525 grams of his ashes. They tested it for carbon, and they created a diamond ring.
Ooh.
They grew a diamond out of the carbon,
Wow.
and they fashioned a ring out of it.
You just
and
gave
then
me like a new idea for what I want to be done with my body after I die. But go ahead.
Well, and they actually, the movie was called The Proposal, and they proposed to this woman who had the archives that they could have his essence, in a sense, if so she was trying to, what was she trying to do? This is why I'm talking about it.
Yeah.
She was actually trying to propose giving the keeper of the archives something of his essence, and what would that have been? I mean, that was a phenomenal thing.
Yeah.
What do you think could possibly have been in there, or what do you think she was trying to give, actually?
Yeah, so I mean, I mean, I'm so like as a cognitive scientist, I immediately go to like mental time travel, and like with crystals, for example, like I really have an affinity for crystals, but not necessarily because I'm like, oh, now the vibrations of the quantum properties are, maybe, but for me, it's more of the mental time travel where it's like, here's a prop, here's a physical prop that helps me contemplate and meditate on the history of this physicality. And that's moving, it's powerful, it's inspiring, it's genuinely transformative. It gives me creativity to like be in a stillness meditation with a selenite crystal and think about how many freaking years it took for this to grow just a couple of millimeters at a time. So in that sense, like, we're very attached to the body and to our physicality. And so to even just have something and have the knowledge or the supposed, the alleged knowledge that like this was a part of the organic body for this individual. There's something very, very profound at a mental level. And then the mental in turn has so many powerful downstream effects. So, I wouldn't necessarily jump into like, oh, it was like a spirit container that they were offering to it. But I mean, unless you understand spirit to be like the breathing of the mind, metaphorically and symbolically. I don't know if that was at all satisfying to you, but...
It blew my mind, actually, when I saw this and when the concept of it just...
Yeah, no, I kind of want my body to be like a huge diamond after I die now.
Creating meaning or inducing it physically through physical intervention, the creation of meaning through physical intervention. Wouldn't it be more fulfilling to think that one can create meaning through one's construction, one's own free will and construction, as opposed to somebody else in an external sense creating meaning? Or is this done only in desperate cases? And is the result the same physiologically in the brain when meaning is created, either one way or the other? But I would prefer to create meaning through struggle and my own personal determination than rely on somebody externally intervening physically through technology.
Sure, and I think that most people would prefer that. And we're talking about cases, though, where these individuals have gone through cognitive behavioral therapy. They've gone through antidepressants. They've gone through trying to think positively and look on the bright side of life and do any number of self-generative approaches to have a stable experience and architecture of meaning. And they would rather not feel that empty void anymore. And so if that means that you have technology stimulate a part of your brain so that you don't feel that crushing existential depression, then yes, like that's a win. You know, we're not talking about a new brave new world where instead of philosophizing or thinking about our existence, now we just go into like rooms where machines press the neural buttons for us. We're not talking about that. We're talking about cases where like individuals have proven to have organic biological failures in the functioning of their meaning production systems. And so trying to understand from a bioengineering point of view, what is the system? How is it breaking? What can we do to restore function?
Who's next?
Oh, I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether the soul, what happens to the soul at death. Also, if Aristotle had any firm conviction on that subject.
Yeah, so keep in mind that when Aristotle is talking about soul, he's talking about something that just like a seal pressed into a wax is necessarily a product of its form. So it doesn't even fit into his framework to think about a soul that exists after the death of the body. However, if we're talking about the pneuma, so we've got different elements to the human being's being. You've got the soma, the body, the psyche, the soul, the nous, the mind, the pneuma, the spirit or the breath of life. And this is where I go back and forth on my understanding of what Aristotle thinks, and maybe that's because his thoughts changed over time. But again, in Eudaimonia ethics, he opens the treatise by saying that in order to achieve good spiritedness, Eudaimonia, that you need to have like the nymphs and the spirits on your side. And I don't know, maybe he's just being like playful, and he's just saying, these are now the personified forces of fate that like we don't have any control over. I personally don't have a strong conclusion about whether Aristotle would have said that, yeah, we have a pneuma or a breath of life spirit that continues after the death of the body. Again, in the De Anima, the closest that he gets to that is when he's talking about the nous poieticos, the active intellect. And that has certainly been elaborated on, especially within Arabic philosophy, as being a transcendent, real entity, like a universal mind that we participate in and that we stop being separated from at the death of the body.
So it lives on in some sense after the death of the body?
So again, this idea of the nous poieticos is like the most debated component of the De Anima. So I'm not going to give you a firm yes or no on that. Myself, I actually try as a discipline to maintain agnosticism on that particular point, and to be wildly open to phenomena and radically engaged intellectually with an understanding and an explanation of those phenomena.
So by no means does the soul's living on after death enter into it as a necessity.
No, and in fact, speaking technically about the soul, the psyche, as an emergent property of the form of the body, it doesn't even fit into that conversation. But again, that's not to say that things like the active intellect or the pneuma couldn't be speculated about their life cycle after the body. For sure, yeah.
So I just had a question on good-spiritedness,
Yeah.
whether or not there have been any studies around that, and if so, what are the metrics, other than fairies, for determining your good-spiritedness? And would you do a study on something like that yourself?
Sure. So again, like if we rein it into the phenomenon, so rather than like necessarily like a supernatural model, but just like what does it mean to experience eudaimonia? Certainly people are looking at that. There was, I think that this summer is like the third in a series of conferences that they're doing at the University of Chicago to understand eudaimonia and its relationship with self-transcendence. So when we gain conscious awareness that connects us outside of our own ego, how is that related causally? How does that cause the experience of eudaimonia? I think it's called like the Virtue and Self-Transcendence Conference, and they might even have online, if you Google University of Chicago Virtue Self-Transcendence, they might have like proceedings of the conference, or at least a listing of scholars whose work you could look at. Oh, but yeah, I mean, here's the thing though, is that like in science, there are two limiting factors. Well, there's lots of limiting factors. Two of the most pressing limiting factors on my mind are, one, your like reputation with your peers, which is very real. And then number two, your funding sources. And so like, yeah, which is also very, very real. So if I got $1 billion grant to study like nymphs and spirits in the brain, I'd be like, screw you guys, I don't care what you think about my reputation, you know? But like as it is right now, like I'm not in that situation. So if you know any billionaires who want to fund it, let me know.
Sorry, just to follow up.
Yeah.
Sorry, my brain just went there. But have you seen the series The OA and the premise behind that show in terms of coming back from the dead or having some sort of like connection with the afterworld and how that affects you in the present?
I haven't seen the OA, but I will say also that I think that it's important to make some philosophical space between the occurrence of a phenomenon and the assumption of its underlying explanation. So I take as very legitimate a lot of mystical experiences, including things like near-death experiences. However, there is a space wide between legitimizing the phenomenon of the experience versus now jumping into the assumption of some particular explanatory framework for that experience. So just to give one example here, if someone has a situation where their brain has been deprived of oxygen for an extended period of time and that their conscious awareness shuts down, like perhaps something that is referred to as phylogenetic memory, or in other words, like the set of instincts that we inherit as a species that, you know, we've hard won over the evolutionary trajectory of selection and reproduction and adaptation. Like perhaps something happens into the brain as it's coming back online that we become aware of different elements of our phylogenetic memory than we're typically able to be aware of. So someone having that where they're like, oh, I died and I came back and I saw all kinds of things that I never even conceived before. Yeah, that could totally be happening and still contained within naturalism, still be totally meaningful, still be information rich, but not require us to then assume some, you know, supernatural explanatory model. Yeah, thank you.
Actually, what you just said right now was sort of skirts around the question that I was going to ask you before, which actually has to do with the repetitive aspect of people experiencing the same phenomena in a near-death experience or death experience, which is seeing light in a tunnel. That particular thing of the light and the tunnel has been apparently referred to time and time again. It's almost a meme, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. So is there something more? I mean, it's interesting that the repetition of this is very interesting. Is there something more solid about this? Is there an explanation that's more physical? Is there a good explanation for this at this point?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll preface my answer by saying that these topics have so little research that's been done on them, and then I'm sorry to say that the majority of the research that has been done has been not that awesome, and so it's very, very questionable to say anything too definitive. I have seen just some speculative work about perhaps the way that the visual cortex gets hyperstimulated during different states might create this halo effect of seeing a tunnel. But I mean, at that point though, it's kind of to be honest, it's just neuroscientists making things up at that.
We're gonna one last.
I think it was first.
Okay, 2 last questions. And
all right.
And we'll Valerie, and then we'll end on Elizabeth.
Okay. Going back to the idea of an important aspect of what you call soul as being able to, address the philosophically existential question of purpose, construction, or, being able to, let's say, derive meaningful purposes for one's life to avoid things like depression and such. I'm thinking that it could be said that there are 2 aspects to a person's engaging with that. One is, their take on, the nature of their life course and what, causal interface they have with, the rest of humanity, let's say, in the future, and and then what actually may happen, as a result of their being alive and things. And I'm thinking that, a very negative example of that might be, let's say, you have some woman who might have a very rich sense of purpose and live, in a beautiful kind of, sort of life space in her mind, but she, in fact, will give birth to somebody who will be a horrible dictator. And, and we can use all kinds of examples like that. And so there will be a disjunction between what she actually believes and what the actuality may prove to be. In a more mundane sense, all of us sitting here, we might be horribly contributing to the crash of the environment, but we don't really have a sense of that maybe immediately. Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect of it. And then another aspect that I wanted to ask about or address is you were saying that it's pretty well known that there are certain areas of the frontal lobes that are involved in being able to construct such purposes and meanings. I'm thinking that, with every evolved faculty, in organisms, that, it can go to, let's say, a minimal or a maximal, or let's say maybe a effective or a pathological aspect. And there's a theory that, for instance, people who we might consider to be paranoid, even let's say paranoid schizophrenics, that in the past, why this particular condition keeps being persistent in the genome, and it's about 1% of the population, is that they had a role in earlier, more primitive human groups, like being shamans or, religious figures, or perhaps even, people who could, explain to a group, what's going on, and, that they have a very rich way of constructing meaning. But in a more modern setting, that richness might be off, let's say pathological. And so I'm wondering if you work with that where, let's say somebody might, it's not so much that they have a deficit of meaning construction, but they might have like a very Baroque, Gothic, almost schizophrenic way of constructing meaning, and that you kind of have to tone it down. Yeah. So I'm just wondering about that aspect of it, whether, that could be addressed too.
Yeah, so taking those one at a time here, with the first one about the example that you gave of, a mother believing like, oh, I want to raise the son to be so noble and to do these wonderful things, right, and to imbue this sense of meaning and purpose. It then turns out to be very, very different in its actual realization than the effort to potentialize in a particular direction. One of the things that Aristotle talks a lot about is the responsibility that we have to engage contemplative wisdom, which is translated as Sophia. And that by engaging Sophia, what we're actively seeking to do is to remove unjustified beliefs from our mind. And so the other example you gave about, like, here we are, like, consuming and, like, contributing in different ways to the carbon footprint and the deterioration of the environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We might have the belief that I'm a virtuous person. And if I have that belief, I'm a virtuous person, then I will operate in a certain way, as opposed to if I have distress of conscience that results from contemplative introspection that removes what might turn out to be an unjustified belief in my own personal virtue. So for the second question, okay.
An excess of, let's say, meaning production in
Right.
a rogue kind of a direction.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about just like in evolution generally, so just like physical genetic evolution, mutations are really important. Having mutations drives innovation. And so we could conceptualize schizotypic thought as cognitive mutation, as a source of cognitive mutation. And maybe 999 out of 1,000 times it's going to be maladaptive. But that one time when it's like, wow, that's a certain type of thought that the neurotypical or the cognitive typical population would not have produced, but it turns out to be very adaptive because the shaman had us realize this particular dynamic that we otherwise would not have come to on our own. That there could be something like that going into play, to where that source of what we typically view as mental illness is creating a type of cognitive diversity that on a large scale could contribute toward innovation and adaptive.
For most of our massive prehistory going back tens, hundreds of thousands of years, well, maybe not hundreds, but let's say tens of thousands of years, maybe that was very functional for the group.
Yeah, yeah. Especially, yep, go. Great questions, great thoughts.
There's a wonderful book called The Soul of an Octopus.
Mm.
And there's a story which I can't find again, and I can't remember how it ends, by Frank O'Connor, the Irish writer. This would have been said in the 40s or 50s. A woman comes to her priest to commission. I think I told you this before, John. Doesn't matter.
I haven't heard it.
No, it comes to her priest to commission a mass to be said for the soul of a departed family member. All very well. But the priest is rather shocked when he realizes that the family member was her dog. And he says, dogs don't have souls. Now, at this time, no Irish woman especially would argue with her priest, would contradict him, but this one does. She says, anything that can love has a soul.
Mm.
The priest tries again, and he says, well, the dog wouldn't be in purgatory, so there wouldn't be any need for a mass to be said. And she says that her late husband isn't either. He was a really good man. She's sure he went straight to heaven. But you have masses said for him. Well, what? Why? Oh, just to let him know I'm thinking of him. Do you think a dog has a soul because it can love?
So a dog certainly has an appetitive faculty because it can love. The appetitive faculty being what we would refer to in more scientific terms as the source of attachment and bonding. So yeah, I mean, Aristotle takes it even further, and he says that insects have souls and plants have souls. So I don't think that he would have any problem with dogs having souls either.
All right,